This Shabbat, we read a beautiful section of Torah. Our ancestors are out there building the first desert sanctuary. This was before there was a temple. And Moses calls upon the Jewish community to be a part of building this brand new structure and to bring everything that would be needed to build this structure: precious metals and fabrics and stone and wood, to make something beautiful. And the Torah says this week that every generous-hearted person brought bracelets and earrings and rings and buckles, all kinds of golden objects. And every man with whom was found blue and purple and crimson wool, linen and goat hair and ram skins dyed red, they brought them to Moses. And every wise-hearted woman spun with her hands, and these women brought spun material, blue and purple and crimson wool and linen. And every man and woman whose heart inspired them to generosity to bring for all the work that the God had commanded them to make, they brought these things to Moses. The children of Israel brought these gifts. And as all of these things were brought, the Torah says the wise men who were building the sanctuary called upon Moses and said, "Moses, the people, they're so moved, they're bringing too much, more than is enough for the labor of the articles which the Lord God had commanded." So God had to tell the people, "Let no man and no woman do any more work. You've done enough for the offering of God." Again, it's a beautiful and powerful story. Our story. It's about us. It's about our ancestors, the Jewish people coming together to build, to create something incredible. As we read these words this week, it's idyllic, these words. Something we should strive for, and something right now that seems so far away these days. Many of you have, and I've said it so many times, if you've been following what's going on in Israel, the judicial reforms and the protests, Israel's in turmoil. And the president of Israel, President Herzog, said this week, "Those who think that a real Israeli civil war, a civil war with lives lost, is a line we will not cross, you have no idea." Precisely now, 75 years into Israel's existence, the abyss, that civil war, is at our fingertips. Here we are, weeks away from Israel's 75th birthday. Weeks before Cheryl and I send our daughter to Israel. Before many of you go off to Israel this summer. The idyllic community of Jews that come together in this week's Torah portion to give so much to build that community centuries ago. To so many of us who have done our part to build the Jewish state. All of this building, all of this dedication, all of this hard work, in many ways it seems so far away. Because the current nightmare in Israel makes the story in this week's Torah portion, and so many of our own warm, loving, caring, passionate feelings about Israel feel like a distant dream. And I, this week, just feel my heart break into millions of pieces. And I know it's not very rabbinic, but I'm angry at what's going on in Israel. And I fear for Israel's future. But when I stop and I breathe a little bit, and when I look at our history, I'm reminded that we Jews, despite the idealism in this week's Torah portion, we have a long history of division and disagreement, and even sadly and tragically, bloodshed. Just look at one of the earliest stories in the Torah, Cain and Abel. I mention this story. It's in our Torah, not to say that our tradition condones harming our brothers and sisters, but to remind us that we've done so in our past. Also in the Torah, Moses is challenged by an angry group of fellow Jews who felt Moses had too much power and had become a dictator. They were led by a guy by the name of Korach. And God picks a side in this battle and opens up the earth, and it swallows Korach and his followers. Jewish brothers and sisters are wiped off the face of the earth because of Jewish division. As the rabbinic tradition started centuries ago and Jews began to argue about how our tradition was supposed to be practiced, the Talmud tells us that disputes multiplied in Israel, and the Torah, which is only one, actually became two Torahs because there was so much division. Jewish division became so intense 2,000 years ago that Jews turned against Jews. They hated each other in what we refer to as sinat chinam, baseless hatred. The hatred was so intense, so strong, that the idyllic community that we talked about in this week's Torah portion, the community that gave and gave to the point that they had to be told to stop giving, this community was but a dream. And the Romans, seeing the internal strife within us, swept in and destroyed us, kicked us out of Jerusalem, and annihilated the ancient temple. Now, thank God, we have rebuilt the land of Israel, which was reborn just about 75 years ago. While we think of this rebirth as a beautiful dream come true, a return of the Jewish people to our land, our home, our place, this rebirth, as some of you might know, had a dark side. As we worked to recreate the Jewish nation, there was tremendous infighting among the Jews. Those two Torahs that the Talmud mentioned centuries ago, they still existed. In fact, there were probably 3, 4, maybe 5 Torahs. Some of you are familiar with a guy by the name of Menachem Begin, who would go on to become one of Israel's prime ministers. And he had a tremendous conflict with another very important guy by the name of Ben Gurion, who was one of the primary founders of the state of Israel and the first prime minister. Begin and Ben Gurion had different approaches to the way we handled the British when it came to creating an independent Jewish state. Remember, the British were there, and we had to somehow get the British completely out. They had different approaches. Ben Gurion oversaw what was called the Haganah, which was the early Jewish state's military. It would eventually become the Israel Defense Force, or the IDF. Begin oversaw a group called the Irgun, which was an offshoot of the Haganah, one that was much more, shall we say, radical. It's an understatement. The words that I share now are Begin's words as these groups were trying to create a new Jewish homeland in what was the Jewish homeland, the land of Israel. He says, 1944 was a year of unspeakable torment. Our sisters and brothers in Europe were being slaughtered in the millions, but Ben Gurion insisted that we, the Irgun, join the Allies in defeating the Nazis before rebelling to expel the British from our land. Begin continued and says, my colleagues and I thought otherwise. Ben Gurion was so hostile to our revolt, he tried to squash it by unleashing his Haganah to round up our fighters and hand them over to the British. It was madness. It was tearing Jews apart. I could smell the stench of civil war. Words that sound frighteningly familiar today. But as familiar as these words might sound to President Herzog's warning, there's a big difference. Begin continues, I told our men to go quietly, though, not to resist Ben Gurion. It was extremely hard to order our men to restrain their natural instinct for revenge, but I had to do it. I had to do it because Ki Yehudim anachnu, we are Jews now. Now hear this, Begin said. Each and every one of you, and hear it well. I live by an iron rule. A Jew must never lift a finger against a fellow Jew. Never. A Jew must never shed the blood of another Jew. Never. 20 centuries ago, we faced the bitter experience of the destruction of the Second Temple, the destruction of our capital, Jerusalem. And why, he asks? Because of our senseless hatred of each other, a hatred that led to civil war and to our utter ruin. B'chiyah ladorot, generations of tears. And therefore, Begin said, I long ago took a solemn oath that no matter the provocation, no matter the circumstances, I would never, ever, ever be a party to civil war. Jumping ahead to June of 1948, just a month after the establishment of the Jewish state, in the midst of the Jewish state's war of independence after being attacked by the Arab world, feeling threatened by outsiders, the state of Israel was on the brink of civil war. A civil war with troops led by two opposing leaders, Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin, facing off in the ultimate power struggle. An Irgun boat coming from France named the Atalena, packed with lots and lots and lots and lots of weapons that the Irgun wanted to use to protect the new Jewish state, was headed towards Israel. It also contained 940 Irgun fighters, many of whom were Holocaust survivors. Ben-Gurion got word of the Atalena. Ben-Gurion was now really fully in charge of Israel, and he felt, probably rightfully so, that this ship threatened the new Jewish state, and he demanded that the weapons be handed over to the new IDF. Menachem Begin, the head of the Irgun, was not up for this, and he was not negotiating. So what happened? 5 weeks after the establishment of the Jewish state, Jewish soldiers that made up the brand new IDF wound up shooting Jewish soldiers on the Atalena. And the men on the boat, despite the fact that Begin told them not to fire if fired upon, were firing back. Jewish brothers were shooting at Jewish brothers. Jewish soldiers on both sides were wounded and killed. A lot of people don't know this story. About this horrific incident, Begin, who was running the shop for this ship, said, I cried that night. I cried because there are fateful times when a choice has to be made between blood and tears. During our initial revolt against the British, blood had to take the place of tears. But at the time of the Atalena, Jew against Jew, tears had to take place of blood. Far better for one Jew to shed tears from his heart than to cause many Jews to weep over graves. Begin said to his followers that night, God forbid that a decision of a democratically elected government of Israel shall ever be defied by force. It is thanks to this democracy that we shall weather every storm, overcome every hurdle, and withstand every test as we shall grow with God's help from strength to strength. As the democratic state of Israel is once again on the verge of civil war, Begin's words hit home. This time, however, the civil war is not over how to defend the Jewish state from the enemy out there, but how to protect the democratic process from those within the state. Sadly, to protect Israel from Jews. Lots of us say we must protect the state from Jews who are threatening to destroy the very democracy that Begin and Ben-Gurion fought for, even while they stood in opposite directions from each other. And then there are those who are saying that democracy needs immediate reform because it's crumbling as a result of a governmental system that has never been codified by a constitution. Many of us gathered before services tonight to talk about the politics associated with all this. I can talk to you about it after. I don't want to go into the details about politics from the Bima right now, but tonight I want to reiterate what Menachem Begin said. Thanks to Israel's democracy, we shall weather every storm, overcome every hurdle, and withstand every test, and we shall grow with God's strength. A Jew must never lift a finger against a fellow Jew, never. A Jew must never shed the blood of another Jew, never. So how do we do this? How do we overcome the present divide in the state of Israel? How do we pull ourselves back from the abyss that President Herzog is warning about? On her Instagram, Israeli actress Hagar Tishman shared a note she received just the other day from an ultra-Orthodox man in the street. Achoti, he wrote, my sister, although there is much division in our state, ani ohev otech, I love you. Because in families, brothers and sisters always remain brothers and sisters. Beautiful words. Idealistic words. Perhaps a fantasy that some, based on what's going on right now, think can never become a reality. But when I go to that place, I think about Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, the hope. It reminds us that we Jews have always had hope. And to have that hope, we simply need to look back at this week's Torah portion, where everyone gave and gave and gave to build our community. We've lived that hope. We've lived that dream. We've been to the abyss before, and we've somehow pulled ourselves back. So tonight, my prayer is that we remember our past and that we learn from our history and somehow, some way, find a way to love each other despite division, and find a way to live by the words of a pretty radical man, Menachem Begin, and ensure that Jews, we don't fight each other, that we change the path and pull ourselves back as an overall arching Jewish community from that dark moment. I shared the overall concept of what I wanted to talk about tonight with Cantor. And she shared with me a couple songs, and this one that she's going to share with you now just really was quite overwhelming to me in its power and its beauty. I don't know if you want to say anything about it, but you know much more about it than I do. I just am struck by its power.
I think it actually speaks for itself. Stand up for me, and we'll stand together. I'm the sky above you, and I love you, everyone. Stand up for me, for your great-grandmother, for your father, brother, and each other, and everyone. Be the light, be the answer, be the music in the dark. stand up for me. And I'll stand beside you. I'm the light that guides you from inside you and everyone. Stand up for me, and I'll stand beside you. I'm the light that guides you from inside you and everyone. And everyone. And everyone.